Tragically, around 150,000 people die around the world every day. Many of these deaths are caused by cardiovascular diseases, cancer, and various other diseases, but today we're going to cover a number of deaths that had very unusual causes. From a murder that actually holds a Guinness World Record, to a plane crash that you would never guess the cause of. Let's investigate. If you enjoy internet mysteries and generally disturbing content, feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for more content like this. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can become a Ko-fi member or a channel member to gain access to uncut videos and other perks, or you can leave me a tip by clicking the thanks under this video. Thanks to anyone who considers this. This video will centre around various deaths that some may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. You can click the link in the description to become a Ko-fi member and watch an uncut and ad-free version of this video, which covers 2 extra deaths that were unsuitable for this cut. Alexander Litvinenko was a former officer of the Russian Federal Security Service, or FSB, who specialized in counter-terrorist activities and infiltrating organized crime. In the early 1990s, he discovered various connections between high-up leaders in Russian law enforcement and Russian mafia groups, and wrote to Boris Yeltsin, the president at the time, about his findings. Despite this, and him also meeting with the FSB director and the deputy director of internal affairs, nothing was done about it, and Alexander began realizing that what he found wasn't an isolated occurrence. The whole system was corrupt. On the 25th of July 1998, Alexander's superior, Boris Berezovsky, introduced him to Vladimir Putin, who on that day became the director of the Federal Security Service. Alexander told him about the corruption he had uncovered, but Putin didn't seem to care, and from that one meeting alone, Alexander even got the vibe that he hated him. A few months later, Boris wrote an open letter to Putin in a national newspaper, alleging that 4 senior officers of the Directorate of Analysis and Suppression of Criminal Groups had ordered his assassination. Shortly after, Alexander did a press conference alongside 4 other officers to discuss his alleged assassination plan. The officers also claimed their bosses had instructed them to kill, kidnap, or frame prominent Russian politicians and business people. Unsurprisingly, after making these allegations, Alexander was fired from his position in the FSB, and it was later revealed that Putin had personally ordered his dismissal. In October 2000, a few months after Putin became president, Alexander and his family travelled to England, where they asked for political asylum and were eventually granted it in May 2001. He soon began campaigning against Putin's government alongside Boris, who had also moved to England and was granted political asylum in 2003. In 2002, Alexander was convicted in absentia in Russia on charges of corruption and was given a 3.5-year prison sentence, though of course he remained in England, where he was eventually recruited by MI6 as a consultant, providing information about Russian government officials and their ties with organised crime that was happening in Europe, particularly in Spain. Shortly after his conviction, Alexander was warned that an FSB unit had been assigned to assassinate him. Throughout his time in England, Alexander made various allegations about the Russian government, in books he wrote and interviews, including that many of the most notorious terrorists in the world, such as Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda leaders, were connected with the KGB and FSB, and also blamed various terrorist attacks on the Russian government. He also made a number of allegations about Putin personally, accusing him of ordering the assassination of a Russian journalist named Anna Politkovskaya, and perhaps more shockingly, claiming that Putin is a paedophile, though there doesn't appear to have been any credible evidence to substantiate this claim. In 2005, Andrei Lugovoy, who Alexander had first met in the 1990s when they were both working for Boris Berezovsky, contacted Alexander asking if they could meet and discuss working together. In October 2006, they ended up meeting, with Dmitry Kovtun too, also an ex-KGB officer. But Andrei and Dmitry's intentions weren't as innocent as they made out. They were actually planning to assassinate Alexander. According to The Guardian, quote, "The men from Moscow were carrying what Kovtun confessed to a friend was a very expensive poison. About its properties he knew little. The poison was polonium-210, a rare radioactive isotope, tiny, invisible, undetectable. Ingested, it was fatal. The polonium had originated at a nuclear reactor in the Urals and a production line in the Russian town of Sarov. A secret FSB laboratory, the agency's research institute, then converted it into a dinkily portable weapon. The quality of Moscow's hired killers had slipped since the glory days of the KGB. Their first attempt in a Grosvenor Street boardroom had not worked. They had lured Litvinenko to a business meeting where, the radiation stain later showed, they had tipped polonium into his cup or glass, but Litvinenko did not touch his drink. As of 1st of November 2006, he was stubbornly alive. On the 1st of November 2006, Alexander met with Andrei and Dmitry again, this time at the Millennium Hotel in London. Earlier that day, Alexander was having lunch with one of his associates. Meanwhile, Andrei arrived at the hotel just after 3:30 p.m. and asked where the toilet was. Less than 15 minutes later, Dmitry did the exact same thing, quote, "Then, at 3:45, Kovtun repeats the same procedure, asking for directions, vanishing into the men's toilets, reappearing 3 minutes later. He is a slight figure. What were the pair doing there? Washing their hands, having set the polonium trap, or preparing the crime, a heinous one, in the sanctuary of one of the cubicles?" Tests were to show massive alpha radiation contamination in the second cubicle on the left, 2,600 counts per second on the door, 200 on the flush handle. Further sources of polonium were found on and below the gents' hairdryer at over 5,000 counts per second. They were what scientists called full-scale deflection, readings so high they were off the scale. The multiplex system shows someone else arriving at 3:59 and 41 seconds, a fit-looking individual wearing a blue denim jacket with a fawn collar. He is on his mobile phone. This is Litvinenko at the blurred edge of the picture. He calls Lugovoy from the hotel lobby to tell him that he has arrived. The CCTV tells us little beyond this, apart from one important detail. Litvinenko never visits the hotel bathroom. He is not the source of the polonium. It is his Russian companions turned executioners who bring it with them to London in this, their second poisoning attempt. This time, their attempt worked. The three men met in the Pine Bar at the hotel, and Andrei and Dmitry ordered various beverages, one of which being a pot of green tea. Alexander couldn't really afford anything for himself in such a pricey establishment, and Andrei had predicted this, so towards the end of the meeting, he told Alexander that there was some tea left in the pot and he could have some if he wanted. Alexander poured the remaining tea in a cup. It was only about half a cup and he drank from it 3 or 4 times. He said it was cold and had no sugar, and he didn't really like the taste, so he didn't finish it. But that didn't matter. He'd already ingested a fatal dose of the poison. Later that evening, he began vomiting and soon had diarrhea with blood in it. He became weak and shaky, and at one point was unable to walk without assistance. On the 3rd of November, he was taken to hospital, where he was initially treated for gastroenteritis. Doctors had no idea that he had been poisoned with a radioactive substance, and Alexander, who had used a pseudonym at the hospital, avoided telling them what had happened, even though he suspected Andrei and Dmitri had something to do with it. His condition worsened over the next few days, and he eventually told doctors his true identity and that he believed he had been poisoned, at which point he was transferred to a different hospital for intensive care. It took another 5 days for the method of poisoning to be identified as polonium-210, but at this point, the damage had already been done. On the 22nd of November, Alexander went into cardiac arrest twice, and although doctors managed to resuscitate him, it happened again the following day, and this time there was nothing they could do. He died at the age of 44. Shortly before his death, he said, quote, "You may succeed in silencing one man, but the howl of protest from around the world, Mr. Putin, will reverberate in your ears for the rest of your life." In late January the following year, British police announced that they had solved the murder of Alexander and that they planned to charge Andrei, who was back in Russia by this time. Andrei denied killing Alexander and claimed the allegations against him were politically motivated. The British Foreign Office formally requested that Andrei be extradited to stand trial for the murder, but the Russian constitution forbids extradition of its citizens to foreign countries, so the request was denied. Russian citizens can be convicted of crimes they committed in different countries by Russian courts, but if Alexander was right, and Putin had ordered his assassination, the chances of the perpetrators being convicted in Russia were pretty slim. There was actually a criminal investigation in Russia, but it determined that Boris Berezovsky was likely responsible. Traces of polonium-210 were found in one of Boris's offices after Alexander's death, but Alexander had visited this office shortly after he was poisoned and before he began experiencing symptoms, so this certainly wasn't evidence of Boris's involvement. Ultimately, although the European Court of Human Rights found beyond reasonable doubt that Andrei and Dmitri murdered Alexander, no one has ever been convicted of his death. Of course, it isn't unusual for people to die from poisoning. It's a murder method that has existed for centuries, but the type of poisoning in this case is very unusual. In fact, Alexander is the only confirmed fatality from malicious polonium poisoning, and he actually holds the Guinness World Record for the first murder by radiation. Polonium-210 was actually a pretty smart murder weapon, considering no one was known to have successfully used it before, so it wasn't until Alexander was on his deathbed that the substance was identified, at which point it was far too late to save him. I'm not even sure if there was anything doctors could have done anyway. Polonium is 250,000 times more toxic than cyanide by weight, and just 1 microgram is more than enough to kill the average adult. It's estimated that 1 gram of polonium would be enough to kill 50 million people and make another 50 million sick. However, it can only cause damage when ingested or inhaled, as it can't penetrate through unbroken skin, which explains why Andrei and Dmitri didn't get sick or die from handling it. Philair was an airline based in the Democratic Republic of Congo that was founded in 1987 and ceased operations in 2015. It was actually on the list of airlines that are banned in the European Union, meaning it couldn't operate within the EU or enter the airspace of any of its member states. In fact, all airlines regulated by the authorities in Congo are also banned in the EU due to safety concerns. Plane crashes are frequent in Congo due to poor maintenance and relaxed air safety standards. According to the BBC in 2019, quote, "Congo's share of world air traffic is tiny, less than 0.1%, but it has accounted for nearly 4% of total air incidents since 2010. Philair had experienced a couple of crashes in the past. The first was in 1988 when the plane was landing at Chicapa Airport. Although the plane was damaged beyond repair, thankfully there were no fatalities. There's next to no information online about the second crash, possibly because it happened in the same month as the US Air Flight 1016 crash, which killed 37 people and seriously injured 20 others. All I was able to find out about the Philair crash is that it occurred in Angola in 1994 and the plane was written off after. This incident doesn't appear on a list I found of fatal crashes in Angola, so I'm guessing no one died. The third crash is more well documented though, and the cause of it was one of the most unusual I've ever heard. On the 25th of August 2010, a LET L410 turbojet passenger aircraft operated by Philair took off from Kinshasa, the capital of Congo. It was a domestic flight with stopovers in Kiri, Bokoro, Semendwa, and Bandundu before it would return to Kinshasa. The aircraft was a newer model that could land on short and unpaved runways and operate under extreme conditions, which was ideal for some of Philair's operations. However, it wasn't designed to withstand the bizarre situation that ended up occurring. The pilot was actually the owner of Philair, a 62-year-old Belgian man named Danny Philomot, and his first officer was 39-year-old Chris Wilson. There were 18 passengers and one flight attendant. As the plane was approaching Bandundu Airport at around 1 p.m, it crashed into a house about 1 kilometre short of the runway. No one was injured on the ground, but 19 of the 21 people on board were killed instantly, and one of the 2 survivors who were taken to hospital died later from their injuries, leaving only one survivor, one of the passengers. One human survivor, that is. There was also one reptilian survivor. The Congolese Ministry of Transport opened an investigation into the accident, and at first it seemed a bit of a mystery. They initially suspected the aircraft had run out of fuel, but it was later determined to have 150 litres of fuel remaining. There were no other obvious causes, and it wasn't until the only survivor of the crash spoke with investigators that it became known what happened. According to the woman, one of the other passengers had smuggled a crocodile onto the plane, which he planned to sell after landing. It was in a duffel bag, and as the plane was descending to land, the crocodile escaped from the bag, sparking panic among the passengers. The flight attendant rushed towards the cockpit, and all the passengers quickly followed, which caused a weight shift and sent the plane off balance. The pilot was unable to rebalance the plane, and as a result it crashed. Although the crocodile survived the crash, it was killed with a machete by authorities shortly after. While this explanation for the crash is the most widely accepted in the media, it is important to note that the official investigation was unable to draw any definitive conclusions due to not being in possession of the flight recorder data. One of the investigators said that the survivors' claims were extremely unlikely, but that they wouldn't rule it out completely. Obviously, I'm not an expert on plane crashes, but unless the survivor was outright lying, it would be a bit of a coincidence if the crocodile incident actually happened and the plane crashed at the same time due to a totally unrelated cause. On the 11th of January 2013, the body of 17-year-old Kendrick Johnson was found upside down, rolled up in a gym mat in Lowndes High School in Georgia, where he was a student. Although the circumstances initially appeared potentially suspicious, the death was eventually ruled an accident after a 4-month investigation, with the cause being positional asphyxia. It's thought that Kendrick had stored a pair of shoes in the mats, as other students also did, and that he was trying to retrieve them when he got stuck and was unable to get back out. This was supported by another student who shared a pair of Adidas shoes with Kendrick and said that after gym class, Kendrick would, quote, go to the mats, jump up, and toss the shoes inside the middle of the hole. However, Kendrick's parents weren't convinced and believed he had been murdered. In June 2013, they arranged for Kendrick's body to be exhumed and for an independent autopsy to be performed. Not only did this autopsy determine that the cause of death was blunt force trauma, it also discovered that his organs had been replaced with newspaper. The funeral home was questioned, and they claimed that they never received any of Kendrick's organs, and that they had been told that after the autopsy, the organs had been destroyed through natural process and discarded by the prosecutor. The Georgia Secretary of State's office determined that the funeral home did not follow best practice, and that other materials would have been more acceptable to stuff the body with, but ultimately determined there was no real wrongdoing. Still, this seemed suspicious to the parents, and they sued the funeral home, convinced there was some large-scale conspiracy at play. In October 2013, the investigation into Kendrick's death was reopened. Other potentially suspicious details in the case include: blood splatter was found on the walls in the gym where the body was found. Paper towels covered in blood were found in the bin in the girls' toilets. The shoes he was wearing that day were found tucked in the mat next to his legs, rather than on his feet. 2 of the CCTV cameras at the school were missing footage that day. One was missing 1 hour and 5 minutes, and the other 2 hours and 10 minutes. In 2015, Ebony magazine published a series of articles naming 2 students as possible suspects in Kendrick's death, though I'm not sure if these students were ever officially suspects in the investigation. They were brothers and were the only 2 students who refused to be interviewed by police, as advised by their father, who also hired a lawyer for them. 2 years prior to Kendrick's death, he apparently got into a fight with the younger brother. Their father was an FBI agent, which tied into the theory of a cover-up suggested by Kendrick's family. In June 2016, it was announced that the investigation would be closed again and no criminal charges would be filed, with a statement from the Department of Justice, quote, after extensive investigation into this tragic event, federal investigators determined that there is insufficient evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone or some group of people willfully violated Kendrick Johnson's civil rights or committed any other prosecutable federal crime. Kendrick's family still could not accept that his death was an accident though, and had filed a $100 million lawsuit against 38 individuals, including 3 of Kendrick's classmates and various local, state, and federal officials. They alleged that the FBI agent had told his 2 sons and a classmate to attack Kendrick, which resulted in his death, and that everyone named in the lawsuit had somehow been involved in a conspiracy to cover up the murder. The family eventually withdrew the lawsuit, and the judge ordered them and their attorney to pay over $292,000 in legal fees to the defendants, and also accused them of fabricating evidence to support their allegations. Although the circumstances surrounding Kendrick's death do seem potentially suspicious when you first hear about them, 3 criminal investigations have now concluded that it was an accident, as the case had been reopened again in 2021 by the Lowndes County Sheriff, who offered $500,000 of his own money as a reward for any information that would lead to a murder conviction. 13 months later, this investigation was also closed, with no charges filed, and the county sheriff said, quote, there was no homicide, no cover-up, no conspiracy in the January 2013 death of the teen. It was simply a tragic and bizarre accident. I remember hearing about Kendrick's death around the time it happened and being fairly sure that it was a murder. I had no idea what happened with the civil lawsuit, or that the family had been accused of fabricating evidence there. There was actually a pretty good write-up on the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit that mostly convinced me that it was in fact an accidental death. Here are a few excerpts. Every student in the gym where Kendrick was found was interviewed that day and everyone's story lined up. A video was taken of the scene. 2 pairs of shoes were found in the mat with Kendrick. 1 pair were shoes he had been wearing. They were off his feet, on top of his body, near his feet and legs. Another pair, the pair he was retrieving, were on the floor, underneath his body, near his head. The only new blood found at the scene was inside the mat. No blood was found on the outside of the mat. No blood was found on the schoolbook and yellow folder Kendrick was carrying. No blood was found on his lower extremities or on the shoes he was wearing. Some old blood was found on a column near the mats, but it was determined to not be from Kendrick. Bloody tissues were found in the trash can of the gym girls' bathroom. How this is in any way suspicious or unusual is beyond me, but Lowndes County tested it and it was found to be female DNA. A girl reported to Lowndes County that she was hit in the face with a flag during a practice and the bloody tissues were hers. No blood was found in or on the second pair of shoes. The blood had dripped from Kendrick onto the floor, pooling around the shoes underneath him, which I think solidly points to Kendrick not bleeding before he went into that mat, only after. In June 2013, with the financial and administrative help of the NAACP and SCLC, the Johnson family arranged for the exhumation of Kendrick's body for an independent autopsy to be performed by private pathologist Dr. William Anderson. It was during this autopsy when it was famously found that Kendrick's organs were missing and his body stuffed with newspaper. The state of Georgia determined that though not the best practice, filling body cavities with newspaper isn't illegal, and the funeral home broke no laws. Regardless, the Johnsons decided to sue the funeral home. During the second autopsy, Dr. Anderson disputed the GBI's findings and determined that Kendrick died of blunt force trauma, right neck. How did he come to that conclusion? From a 2 to 3 centimeter bruise. That's it. No broken neck or throat bones, no signs of internal exsanguination, just a tiny bruise measuring less than an inch in length. And this is apparently the first and only time in history that this injury has been a cause of death. It's important to point out that Dr. Anderson does not claim that Kendrick was beaten. He has never stated that Kendrick's facial injuries are from anything other than skin slippage due to his position. The only people claiming that Kendrick was beaten to death are the Johnsons and their supporters. And for what it's worth, Dr. Anderson is now a private pathologist after being fired from the state of Florida for a myriad of unprofessional and unethical actions on his part. Lee Touchton, in following up on information provided to her by the Johnson family and their attorneys, discovered that both family members and attorneys were lying to her and the media about many aspects of the case. Touchton then resigned from their NAACP in disgust at their continued involvement with the Johnson family. Touchton then began working with Rev Rose and the SCLC, who investigated Kendrick's death again and concluded without a doubt that Kendrick died accidentally. It was Kenneth Johnson who identified his son's body. He has claimed to the media that while making the identification, he noticed that both the room and storage drawer Kendrick was in was heated. Jackie Johnson has also run with this and told reporters that the Valdosta crime lab purposefully heated her son's remains in order to destroy evidence. This is heavily disputed by Lee Touchton, who toured the lab and personally verified that alarms are armed to go off if room and storage temperature rises above the appropriate temperature. She also viewed the emergency generators that are tasked to keep the lab cool in emergencies. During rallies and on Facebook, the Johnsons have claimed that not only are the Bellboys responsible for Kendrick's death, but the Lowndes County Sheriff's son, sometimes they say grandson, is also somehow involved. But Sheriff Prine does not even have a son or grandson, much less a son or grandson at LHS. The photo of Kendrick's post-mortem face, made famous by his parents, who place it on large signs to display at their public rallies and post it all over Facebook, is usually the tipping point for many people to agree with them about Kendrick being beaten to death. Most people believe that is how Kendrick looked when he was pulled out of the mat. The photo the Johnsons used for shock value is Kendrick post-autopsy, after the skin of his face was peeled back to examine the underlying muscles. Who took the photo and why, and how the Johnsons came into possession is something I could never track down. Edit. During a deposition of Kenneth Johnson, father of Kendrick, it was revealed that the photo was taken at the funeral home by the Johnson family themselves. But interestingly, I personally think that the second photo looks way more consistent with a beating than the first. I'm really wearing out my own stamina at this point, and there's no way to list every single questionable action by the Johnsons. They have burned many bridges in their quest. They're not above posting the addresses of innocent people on their Facebook page. They've even posted photos of Kendrick's classmate's 92-year-old grandmother with the caption, "Justice will be served." This classmate had absolutely nothing to do with Kendrick or the Bells or Sheriff Prine's invisible son. His mother simply posted a correction to yet another claim they made on Facebook. They've said Rev Rose stole the money Al Sharpton helped to raise. They've said that the school board superintendent personally placed Kendrick in the mat. They've said no one from the school attended Kendrick's funeral. Over a dozen attended, and a coach gave a eulogy. The list goes on and on. But despite what the Johnsons and their advocates want the world to believe, facts are facts. And those facts are that none of Kendrick's blood was found anywhere outside of the mat. Neither autopsy found any defensive wounds, and the two suspects have rock-solid alibis. That post was titled, "Kendrick Johnson's death is not an unresolved mystery," and was written by the Reddit user, the Chairman Meow. I only read parts of it and would highly recommend checking out the entire post if you want to know more. Anyway, as much as I would like to say that Kendrick's family were grieving and that's why they couldn't accept the accidental death ruling, I really can't defend their actions when it comes to blatantly lying about the details surrounding the case and falsely accusing two innocent students of murder. Kendrick's death was absolutely tragic, but there is no evidence to suggest it was anything but an accident, and trying to paint it as something else is doing a disservice in my opinion. This case could have absolutely served as a lesson to others, to avoid more deaths occurring in a similar way, but instead it's been exploited. I do still have some level of sympathy for Kendrick's parents. They still lost a son, and I can't even imagine how heartbreaking that would be, but unfortunately their actions have only caused further suffering. In 2010, Sam Ballard was a 19-year-old rugby player living in Sydney, Australia. He should have had his whole life ahead of him, but little did he know that one careless decision would destroy his future. It was the weekend and there was a gathering at his friend Jimmy's house. They were all drinking wine and socialising when a garden slug crawled out in front of them. One of Sam's friends dared him to eat it, and he did. At first, everything seemed fine. They all laughed about it and continued having fun. It wasn't until a few days later that Sam began experiencing severe pain in his legs, then vomiting and dizzy spells. He became weak, and his mother soon took him to the hospital. At first, she worried that these might be early symptoms of multiple sclerosis. Her husband suffered with this, so naturally it was on her mind. When Sam told her that he'd eaten the slug, she was sure that that couldn't have made him sick, but doctors soon told them otherwise. It turned out that the slug had been infected with a parasitic worm called Angiostrongylus cantonensis, and when Sam had eaten it, he also ingested the worm, which caused him to develop rat lungworm disease. As the name suggests, the parasite lodges into the lungs of rats and is later excreted in feces, and when a slug eats that feces, it also becomes infected with the parasite. When a human becomes infected, the worm larvae does not pass through the digestive tract as it does in rats. It can get lost and end up in the brain, where it remains and can cause eosinophilic meningitis, an inflammation of the membranes surrounding the brain and spinal cord. Symptoms of this type of meningitis include headaches, blurred vision, vomiting, fever, stiff neck, tingling sensation or numbness in the skin, and sensitivity to light. Most cases of this are usually mild and patients recover fully without treatment. However, Sam wasn't so lucky. Shortly after the diagnosis, he fell into a coma that lasted for 420 days. When he woke up, he was diagnosed with a serious brain injury that left him paralysed, unable to eat without a tube, and barely able to even move. He couldn't go to the bathroom without help or control his body temperature and was now prone to seizures, meaning he required round-the-clock care. His mum hoped that he would one day be able to walk and talk again, but as more time passed, this seemed less likely. He ended up spending 3 years in hospital, and when he was released, he still wasn't able to walk or talk, but could operate a motorised wheelchair. Despite Sam's inability to talk, his family and friends still felt his personality. His mum said, quote, "He is still the same cheeky Sam and laughs a lot." And Jimmy, his friend who hosted the gathering in 2010 where Sam ate the slug, said, "He's in there 100%. I apologised to Sam about everything that happened that night in the backyard, and he just started bawling his eyes out. I know he's there." Although friends and family did see some improvement in Sam's condition over the years, such as him being able to reach out his hand to shake, sadly he never actually recovered, and he died in November 2018, 8 years after eating the slug. Sam's story serves as a tragic reminder that actions can have very unexpected consequences, and what seems like a harmless death could actually end up ruining and shortening your life. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments, plus any suggestions you might have for future videos. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Huge thank you to my Ko-fi members and channel members whose names are on screen now. I really appreciate your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time in a new video.